Welcome to The General and the Journalist, our podcast from the Times and the Sunday Times about conflict and the old global order breaking down. I'm General Sir Patrick Sanders and the journalist is Tom Newton-Dunn.
Patrick, I am separated from you today. A great point of sadness. I'm at the NATO Summit in The Hague, speaking to you, in fact, from an underground car park. There are pillars behind me from this car park, believe it or not, that's been tilted up into a giant media centre, repurposed as it is for this great momentous moment.
And I'm looking out across St Paul's and the Thames and the Tower of London from the newsroom of the Times and the Sunday Times as the best journalists in the world around me write up and analyse the news, not least from NATO. And I'm sitting next to the news editor.
And I can't think of a better place for a general than 100 miles behind the front line where the battle actually is, talking about high-fluting stuff rather than in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the ignominy is not lost on me with you forward and me in the rear. But as chateaus go, this is not bad. And you lead a pretty cushy life as journalists working from here. Anyway, this summit is a pivotal moment in NATO's history. And the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, called it a quantum leap in collective defence, which builds the foundation for a stronger, fairer and, crucially, more lethal NATO.
And there's a big headline, and that is that member states have announced a commitment to significantly increase funding for defence. Everyone is going to, we think, invest 5% of their GDP annually to counter all the growing threats.
Yeah, and funding, of course, was the issue that was forced on the table by President Trump, who has long insisted that the US has been paying more than its fair share. And, of course, he's not the first US president to have made that point. But we're going to pick through this NATO announcement, and in particular, whether the announced increase in defence spending will come in time to deal with the growing threat to Europe and particularly from Russia. So what does it mean for our united collective defence and what does it mean for Ukraine?
And the key question is, did NATO step up? This is a crucial moment. Did NATO step up? Or, to put it another way, is NATO waving or drowning? So, Patrick, first of all, though, we should reflect on just how much of this summit has been about one single man, that man being Donald Trump. The entire thing has been tailored around him, really. His press conference has just finished. There's a lot of activity behind me. All the American journalists and everyone else rushes back from having really hung on his every word. It's the shortest summit I've ever been to. It was only 18 hours long from start to finish. It's now formally finished. It's also the most expensive, interestingly. 183 million euros it's cost to host it. Throughout, President Trump has been fluffed, there's another word for it, fluffed by everybody from King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands downwards, as a great man, as a peacemaker, as a hero. And all of that and the curtailing is to try and put him in a good mood, get him to like NATO and hopefully not blow the whole thing up. And the idea being when you shorten and squeeze everything into just a tiny period of time, it gives him less time to have other ideas and wreck it. So the backdrop of all this, though, has also been there's been a conflict 5,000 miles away that NATO has nothing to do with, the Israel-Iran war. And Trump's move throughout the entire day or two has been largely dictated by developments elsewhere, over there, not in The Hague. Trump, of course, declared a great victory, and he said everyone had respect for the role of the USA. What happened? Well, on Sunday, the US joined the Israel-Iran war by launching bunker buster bombs on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, and an almost symbolic response from Iran, shaky ceasefire, then emerged. So, Patrick, your reaction to how Trump and the US military played it, the Iran attack, if you like, and how much effect that's had on this summit?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? When you've heard the press conferences, probably 2/3 of the questions in those conferences have been around the strikes on Iran and the ceasefire. I mean, for me, this whole operation, these last 12 days, have been a combined demonstration of complete military dominance by the two most advanced and operationally sophisticated militaries in the world. And perhaps the most important thing about these last 12 days is I think it has reinforced the credibility of the West, not just with Iran, but with Russia, with China and with North Korea. And you think back to Obama's failure to enforce a red line in Syria in 2013. You think about the really limp Western response to the Russian occupation of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, then the fall of Kabul. All of that created real doubts in the minds, a sort of conviction from people like Putin that the West had lost its nerve, it lost its chutzpah. And I think that this will have done an awful lot to dispel doubts about US resolve in the minds of Xi, Putin, Kim Jong-un, and of course, crucially, of the Supreme Leader Khamenei.
I think it's a really interesting take on it. I must bring you back, however, to the whole point of the Israel-Iran war. The reason why Israel started, the reason why the US said they joined it, and that was to totally destroy Iran's nuclear program. And whether or not it did has been a row that's certainly dominated, if not the summit itself, and pretty much everything else that was going on in the press conferences and a lot of what Donald Trump was saying. And that's all because of a highly classified early battle damage assessment done by the US intelligence agencies, which got leaked last night to various US outlets. So the New York Times, CNN and CBS networks also saw bits of it. And it was a little devastating, really, to Trump's narrative because it said it hasn't totally destroyed the Iranian nuclear program. From what we think at the moment, the ding-dong of the press conference we just had was all about that. He was absolutely sticking it to individual journalists from those organizations. Instead, he says we've destroyed Iran's nuclear capability for decades. And he even equated the entire thing to the nuclear bombs that the US dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, saying essentially what we did ended the war. What do you think, Patrick? Do you buy that, or do you even buy 50% of that?
Well, so we used language really carefully and with precision when it comes to military operations because we define what these words mean. And destroy is a word that you use very rarely because it means almost exactly what it says. You have to remove everything. And to do that with a military mission takes enormous resources and is almost impossible to achieve. So first of all, the language is not helpful. But I think, in this whole war of words on the relative effectiveness of the US and Israeli strikes, I think Trump made a mistake in claiming and using language like obliteration and doing that too soon. And I think the DIA report, which of course the New York Times and the CNN have been reporting all day, was almost certainly in itself premature. Because when we do what we call battle damage assessment, so that's working out whether a mission succeeded or not, it is layered. It's cumulative. It takes time. And there's a whole process to it. So your first step is, what are the pilots seeing? What are the aircrew seeing? Can they report back during the mission that they actually hit the target? And we know that they did. Secondly, you then turn to what we call image intelligence, and that's satellites. It might be feed from drones. It might be feeds from jets that are done on overflight. Then on top of that, you layer on signals intelligence, technical intelligence, all the additional sensors you can draw on. And then you get to human intelligence, eyewitness reporting from workers or operators who may have been on the site, or agents, if you have them, who are prepared to go in and have a look. And then finally, you draw on open source intelligence. The point is that you get an initial little bit, but there's, intelligence isn't a snapshot. It's a process that goes over time. And until that process has gone through, we're simply not going to know. So it was a mistake for the White House to claim obliteration or mission success so early. And the DIA report was almost certainly too premature as well. So I think the key thing is that Israel and the US have demonstrated over the last 12 days complete intelligence and operational dominance and superiority over Iran. And the people I've been speaking to in the IDF and in the Mossad are confident that they can maintain that edge going forward, and Iran knows that. So I think this is a really significant setback for Iran. But as I say, we'll have to wait for the bomb damage assessment.
I think what we both agree on with Iran is that it's far from over. And there's an irony, really, if you like, because, here I am and here we are talking about the biggest military alliance in the world, meeting here at The Hague, when Trump chose to act alone that week. What do you think that says about NATO?
Well, one view is that the US is acting as a rogue superpower. I don't think that's the case on this issue. I think that it was entirely legitimate and probably right that the US decided to act unilaterally, or at least in cooperation with Israel. And I think that Trump's actions have strengthened deterrence, and I think they have strengthened the credibility of the US, but also the West more broadly. And that's how these things work. There are some issues that you act on unilaterally. We did it in the Falklands. There are some issues that you act on multilaterally as part of a collective security arrangement. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And that's, I think, what this summit has told us, because the leaders at this summit do seem quite united. So it's possible, I think, that NATO might just be the only multilateral institution that Trump values.
Okay, Your glass is always half full when it comes to NATO things like that, which I admire you for.
Anyway, before we get into the detail of the summit agreement, what's it like attending this summit in The Hague, Tom?
Well, you must remember NATO summits. You must have been to dozens in your time in uniform. You had 40 years in uniform.
No, actually, all of my NATO service has been at the sharp end on operations. So in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in Afghanistan. I mean, I've got 3 NATO campaign medals to prove it. I've been a regular visitor to NATO headquarters in Brussels. I always enjoy going there because you see the nations represented by their eating habits. You know, Brits eating at their desks, Italians taking long 2-hour lunches with lots of pasta and some wine. You know, it's a great alliance. But I have been spared the summit treat. But I don't think you have. I think you've been to lots, haven't you, Tom?
I've been to multiple, too many that I can count. And I can tell you what, the eating at our desks is a very current thing amongst all the 32 nationalities of the journalists around me. There is rubbish and Coke cans and hot dog wrappers spewed everywhere. I'm not going to try and show you down our little video link here, though. The summit venue itself is the World Forum, which is a vast convention centre built in the 1960s. And all journalists of all different nationalities, NATO member states, are billeted in this huge, vast, windowless underground car park I was telling you about. I have to tell you, ever so slightly scented with urine in some corners, the broadcast booth edits in particular.
Oh, thanks for sharing, Tom.
But, you want colour? I'll give you colour. We spend our time watching the proceedings, listening to what's going on in the various sort of meetings. There's a myriad of different meetings at the side. Doorstepping ministers and generals when we can, when they walk from one place to another. There's a little place called Doorstep Alley. There's one 50-metre stretch where they go from one building to the other where we can go and we can jump on them, and there's not much they can really do to stop us. But I had to tell you, the thing we've been really doing throughout this one is just obsessing over Donald Trump's Truth Social feed, because that just decides so much. What mood's he in? What's he going to come and say? What is he already saying about NATO? So we've been glued to our phones. And I had to tell you, if you go back a bit, and I've been coming to these NATO summits for sort of, I don't know, 15, 20 years now, NATO summits actually were quite boring. You know, you didn't look forward to them because they were always supposed to be these very carefully choreographed demonstrations of unity and purpose. We're this great alliance, we're all going to stick together and we're going to show the world just how unified they are. And then Donald Trump came along. So there was one in Wales that Cameron and Obama did on a golf course. And that was almost a game of golf with a bit of military chat in the sidelines. The next one, 2018, Donald Trump turns up and exploded the entire thing to everyone's extraordinary surprise. He hijacked it. That one was actually at SHAPE, the NATO military headquarters just outside Brussels. And ripped up the agenda entirely and used the set piece, which is the North Atlantic Council meeting, 3-4 hours long, to just rip into all the different member states for not spending up, particularly vicious on Germany. He called them all delinquent, and he said, we'll walk out and not defend those who haven't spent the right amount. And it was carnage then, and I think that's why NATO leaders, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, has been so careful this time to try and get Trump into the right place by fluffing and compliments and a concertinaed agenda so that he doesn't blow this one up. We live very much in the world of Trump summits these days. And top of his list, of course, was 5% of defence spending, a brand new target, Patrick.
Yeah, and of course the agreement on military spending was unquestionably the most important thing to come out of the summit, and possibly the only thing that everyone really wanted. So the Allies have committed to spending 5% of GDP annually by 2035. That's 3.5% of GDP on hard defence and 1.5% on related areas such as infrastructure, protection and cybersecurity. What's really important, though, for me anyway, is that these will have to be underpinned by annual plans that are going to be submitted to show a credible incremental path to reach that goal. So you can't wait until 2035 and then suddenly go straight to 5%. And this is a huge shift. You know, when Trump announced the 5% target in January, he was still president-elect. I think he talked about it in campaigning. I mean, you'll remember, Tom, you were there. I mean, the reaction in Whitehall was eye-rolling. No one took this seriously.
The interesting part, not to get too techy about it, because you can talk about percentages of this and that for far too long, but that 3.5%, which is on the core defence spending on militaries and armies and the like, and then the 1.5%, which is infrastructure, as you were saying, societal resilience. The 3.5% definition on core military spending is defined by NATO. It's been established for years. There's a fudge coming because the 1.5%, what you have to spend on infrastructure, hasn't been defined yet. There's a row going on in various corridors upstairs behind the scenes as everyone desperately tries to fudge the books. Britain's way of fudging the books is trying to include rural broadband in national resilience. And you can make the argument, yeah, of course we need broadband to keep in touch with people when the Russians are attacking. But it's a bit of a stretch. I put it to one NATO official yesterday and said, what do you think about this rural broadband thing? Their response was to chortle at me, and it probably was a chortle. And they told me, well, that would be a very particular way of defining it.
I mean, okay, so I'm going to try and dig the government out of a hole here. So back in the Cold War, when we had national defence plans, we used to use the AA phone boxes. Do you remember those by the side of the road? And every civil servant had to carry a 2p piece where he was going if you were on the call-out list, so that you could always make a call. So you could argue that this is the modern-day equivalent of the AA phones that supported our integrated defence. I mean, I'm trying to help.
I tell you what, when Number 10 need a news press secretary, I'm going to give them your CV.
Okay, but the main question then is everyone signed up? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about Spain, Tom.
Yeah, and the answer actually is not everyone has signed up at all. There was a huge row in the run-up to the summit with a lot of different member states. Spain was the one that held out. Eventually, everyone said, oh, okay, we'll get to 3.5%. Britain found that quite difficult, by the way. But Spain is the only one that held out and said, there's just no way we're doing that. Prime Minister Sanchez said, I'm not spending 3.5%. I'd rather spend it on welfare and building houses and whatever I might do. The key, if you look very closely in the declaration, the summit declaration, which is, by the way, only a page long. Normally they go on for pages and pages. This one, 5 points, short and tight. Again, nothing to upset Donald Trump. The key is the wording, very loyally. And it talks about allies commit to spending 3.5% on this and 1.5% on that. Not every member state will spend, or every ally will spend it. And that is the opt-out, if you want, for Spain. The problem I think I have with that, Patrick, is it's disappointing, obviously, that Spain don't think they can spend like everyone else will and defend like everyone else will. It also sets a precedent. It means that effectively NATO begins to become a bit voluntary. Well, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. Well, therefore, I might not do that if I don't want to. And Slovakia, another nation, saying already in the last couple of days, well, if Spain aren't going to do it, we don't think we should do it either. Does it worry you as much as it worries me?
I'm much more optimistic about the language that's come out from the declaration, because you can see the clear declaration of intent from almost everybody except for Spain. I know Slovakia has been squeaking a bit about this as well. But first of all, they have to demonstrate progress each year, report back every year. And secondly, everyone is committed to the capabilities that they've signed up to. What they're arguing about is how much that will cost. And it's really only Spain and Slovakia that is arguing. And this isn't the first crisis that NATO has faced. I mean, we think of these things as huge crises. I mean, there was Suez in 1956. There was de Gaulle pulling out of the integrated military command structure in 1966. There was Macron saying that NATO was brain dead in 2019. And yet here we are, and NATO is arguably as strong, if not stronger than it's ever been. But on Spain is unquestionably earning a reputation now.
We'll come back to that, though, Patrick, but stronger than it's ever been. That's a hell of a statement. That's a Number 10 press secretary statement you've just written again, but we'll come back to that.
No, I mean, I think it's true. I mean, you think about, so first of all, NATO's expanded. Secondly, you've got countries that have joined NATO, like Finland and Sweden, that are net providers. They added enormous amounts to the alliance. The exception is Spain. I mean, Spain is now a security taker. And I think what Prime Minister Sanchez is doing, which is essentially to save its political skin back home, is shameless.
Let's come back to just how much NATO members are really going to commit to this. There's another massive point, though, here on the 3.5% or the 5% spending commitment, and that's when. So, yes, we may all get to that or may not, but when we get to that, has been the row that's really has dominated the build-up to this quite quietly, although it's broken out in the media every now and then. And there's basically three broad groups, I think, Patrick, from hanging around here and talking to various people, that you can divide those 32 NATO member states into. First, there's the big spending hawks, so the Baltic countries, Poland, Finland as well. Really interestingly, Germany now. Then you've got the second category, who I'd call the sort of the hawkish big talkers, but not much trousers to go along with their mouth. And I've got to tell you, France, a big leader of that, and also the United Kingdom. We were very, very slow in committing to 2035. And then you've got the low-spending doves. Spain, we've just talked about. They got themselves a complete opt-out. Hungary, Slovakia, Italy. There's another way of judging the need for this, if you'd like, and whether or not 2035 is the right target or should have been earlier. And that's to talk to the countries closest to the threat. So Estonia, one of the Baltics, that is that country. They're the most northern and remote of the three Baltic states. They share a 180-mile long border with Russia itself. And when I spoke to Estonia's foreign minister in Doorstep Alley, he was kind enough to give me some of his time, their foreign minister, Margus Tšakna, he told me this. 3.5% by 2035, that's far too late, isn't it?
Yeah, we support 2030.
But it's not going to be 2030.
Probably not for everybody, but Estonia is doing next year 5.4% already.
Do you feel let down by Britain, France, who
No, to be
refusing?
honest, this is a historical decision we could have made already 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating insight from the Estonian foreign minister, because what it reveals is the sense of imminence and proximity to the threat when you live next to Russia. And remember that the NATO Sec General, so it's not just the Estonians, Mark Rutte issued a very stark warning at Chatham House last month that Putin will be ready to attack NATO within 5 years. And if we don't believe our own Sec General NATO, let's just listen to what Putin's been saying. Because, so far, if you want to know what Putin's going to do, just listen to what he's saying. So he's talking about Russia working to increase its combat capabilities. So they're increasing the size of their armed forces from 1.2 million to 1.5 million. They're creating a new unmanned systems force as a branch of the Russian military. They're creating 2 new military districts in Moscow and Leningrad. They're growing their naval infantry brigades into divisions. They've got improved strategic missile forces. They're producing Oreshnik ballistic missiles, new ships and new submarines for the Russian Navy. So just look at what Putin is saying and what he's doing. The combination of intent to restore Russian historic lands and capability tells you that there is an imminence to this threat.
Mark Rutte also said a couple of really fascinating facts that I guess shook me, that I know the argument ideologically or intellectually, but when you see the reality, so he revealed that Moscow now pumps out 4 times the volume of ammunition in a single year than every single other NATO alliance country put together. So that's everybody, all 31, including the Americans, and Russia still produces 4 times the amount, which is just an extraordinary credit, you like, to their war machine. And he also identified NATO's biggest capability weakness was missile defense. But I didn't know just quite how weak we were until he said we need currently 5 times as many air defense systems to properly defend the continent, to defend NATO's European countries from a missile attack than we currently have today. So, Patrick, all this talk about money, it's all pointless if the war comes one day and we don't have the arms to win it, isn't it? So will this agreement, will what's currently written down and all the caveats solve the problem?
No, so obviously statements alone aren't going to fill the problem. So spreadsheets and spending profiles and spending plans only matter when they result in real military capability. And we can spend all the money in the world, but if we don't spend on the right things to actually increase these capabilities that NATO needs at a speed that is relevant to that threat that we were describing, it doesn't matter. So for me, the acid test for this summit is really simple. I can phrase it as a question. By 2030, will NATO member states have provided the military resources for the defensive plans for each part of NATO? And those are plans that they approved 2 years ago at Vilnius, and give Sakur what he needs and what he's asking for. Because he's been really clear that he needs forces at readiness to deter Russia by 2030, not by 2035. And if we want to boil this down to, which nations are doing well, you pointed to Germany. There's a country that has recognized the imminence of what they need to do and the speed of their response. I'm afraid the UK are in the opposite camp.
It's a fascinating shift in positions, isn't it?
So Sakur, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Chris Cavoli, has got one principal ask. Top of his list of things that he wants from the UK is a strategic reserve corps. That's one of 2. And that will consist of 2 divisions. And that's on top of the brigade that will have run on the front line ready to commit to defend Estonia. And we know that the spending profile of what the government is proposing isn't going to address the huge gaps that exist in that force before 2035. Don't take my word for it. I can't talk about it. But RUSI set this out last year and listed exactly how many shortfalls they were. A lack of brigades, a lack of enablers, and against something called the NATO defence planning process, the UK performs really badly when it comes to land forces. So the UK is not recognising, is not doing enough to be able to provide Sakur with what he needs. And these we talk about spending as much as we like. If it doesn't result in forces committed to Saka in time, then all of this is just talk.
And all these different national positions, who's spending what? It's a huge shift, isn't it, from, you think, 10 years ago. Britain was a big spender, the biggest in Europe 10 years ago, I think, apart from Greece. Now, we're 10th down the league table. The Doves are the ones that used to be the Hawks, and the Hawks used to be the Doves.
Yeah, and it could mean a real shift in power within NATO. So traditionally, of course, the leaders of NATO in Europe have been France and the UK. But increasingly, you've seen the sort of centre of gravity of weight of power of influence in NATO shift towards Germany and, of course, towards Poland. And you only have to understand why that's happening when you look at what these different countries are committing. I mean, Poland now is top of the spending list. It's spending 4.1% of GDP. Germany is going to increase its funding, becoming NATO's second largest spender after the US by 2029. And it's building the strongest conventional army in Europe.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And you look at the geography, strange enough, those closest to Russia are getting the ticket. They're getting the message.
Yeah, but the big difference is Germany. Germany's never wanted to lead. And of course, this really has shifted the dial.
Let's also talk about Article 5, Patrick, because that came out. Article 5, of course, is the central bit of NATO and the philosophy behind it, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. And after this summit, is it still rock solid? It's been debated, it's been questioned. So the wording in the communique, in the declaration, that title one-pager I mentioned earlier, it's strong. It talks about our ironclad commitment to collective defence and Article 5. That's great. But Donald Trump did somewhat blow this whole thing up yet again on Air Force One, on the plane over last night before he landed, to say, well, do you still stand by Article 5, Mr. President? And he said, well, it depends how you define Article 5. There are numerous definitions. And there just aren't, though, Patrick. There's one.
And of course, the definition is exactly as you described it and is reinforced in the communique. And Tom, you've been reporting on President Trump much more closely than I have. I mean, you know that he can say two completely contradictory things in the same speech. We shouldn't read too much into it. So I think he dislikes being pinned down by reporters, but the communique says what it says. I am firmly of the conviction that Article 5 still does count. And what he did say in the press conference afterwards was, I left this conference feeling differently to when I got here. And we're here to protect their countries. And he was talking about NATO member states and the US doing that. I think it is a good guarantee.
And I think that's a fair point. He was definitely warmer towards the end of the summit, but we shall see. Because, of course, Article 5 has never been tested apart from once after 9/11.
Yes, and that was triggered by our guest last week, Lord Robertson. Anyway, that's the spending. Let's talk about Ukraine, which was relegated a little bit as an issue. I mean, how do you think that played out, Tom?
Yeah, it's interesting, wasn't it? Because Ukraine, along with the new defence spending target, was the two big issues of this. It looked like Israel and Iran and Donald Trump's rowing with everybody was going to really push it down the agenda. I think, however, NATO are going to be pretty pleased by this. The conversations I've had in the last couple of hours, people are actually quite happy with how it's gone. There was a scenario, we can reveal this, conversations we've had, where NATO officials, there was a scenario where they thought, well, actually, maybe we just don't have Zelensky here at all. Maybe his presence at the Leaders' Summit would wind up Donald Trump so much it could be a blow-up moment. None of that has happened. Zelensky has been here and things have gone okay. And actually, he's just had a bilap with Donald Trump, a meeting, a face-to-face meeting with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was pretty warm about him. He said, in his own words, the meeting could not have been nicer. I wanted to see him because I wanted to ask him how he was doing. Massive change of language to, you think back to the terrible Oval Office dressing down that's gone down appalling in history. And a big practical development, big deal for Ukraine. Donald Trump agreed to sell Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine. He said that. He was asked about it in the press conference, in fact, by a Ukrainian journalist, a female journalist whose husband was at the war at the front. I think that actually quite moved Donald Trump, talking to her, engaging with her, because she was shaking with emotion when she was asking the question. He said, yeah, we will sell those Patriots. And only a month ago, Donald Trump had diverted a shipment of anti-aircraft missiles heading to Ukraine to the Middle East to give to Israel. So all round, I think that's certainly the glass half full. I think Zelensky would be pretty pleased with this and put it down, certainly his engagement with Donald Trump, as a win.
Yeah, I mean, the statement is weaker in terms of condemning Russia. I mean, previous statements have absolutely pointed to Russia as being to blame for what's happened in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians must have felt a little bit aggrieved that Russia wasn't being held to account. But I guess they must be reassured and buoyed by the support that you've described them getting and the good words from Trump today.
There's another thing we should touch on, because I have to say it troubles me a bit. And over the last couple of days and the preceding weeks, I think it's now far from clear that all 32 member states all agree who NATO's enemies actually are. So you look at some of the Central European countries, arguably they look closer to Moscow than they are to us sometimes. Hungary always vetoes any new sanctions against Russia that the EU tries to propose. Today, Viktor Orban, Hungary's prime minister, refused to even call Russia an enemy when he was asked, or even a threat. He said, no, they're not a threat, and was adamant that NATO would have no role in Ukraine. And President Zelensky of Ukraine last week accused Hungary of actually spying on Ukraine's air defences for Russia. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump, who we know will not exert hard pressure on Vladimir Putin, wants to be Putin's friend, and certainly wouldn't sign up to calling him an enemy. And if you've got an alliance who can't even agree who you're supposed to be opposing, that's a problem.
Well, I'm going to point to the conversation we had with George Robertson last week, Tom, where he reminded us that NATO's greatest strength is that it was 32 democracies, and its greatest weakness was that it was 32 democracies. This is an alliance that has room for people to disagree. I think quite the opposite. I think the summit communique has been extraordinarily clear about recognizing Russia as the threat to Euro-Atlantic security. It says it in black and white in there. And we've been here before. Previously, the southern European states weren't that interested in talking about Russia as a threat, whereas now NATO, I think, is much, much more unified and is very clear, regardless of what a few individuals like Orban would say about who the threat is.
Okay. Patrick, we need to start calling this. From me in The Hague to you in the Times newsroom in London, has NATO answered the big challenge here? Is NATO waving or is NATO drowning? What do you think? Do you want to go first?
So I like the poetic reference there, Tom. So I think it's not a question of waving or drowning. I think it's a question of, is it sinking or is it rising? And I think it's rising to the occasion. I mean, with the notable exception of Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain, who I think has let his country down, I think NATO has risen to the occasion because it's done what every NATO summit needs to do, which is broadly to represent NATO solidarity, unity, alliance cohesion. The issue of 5% of GDP was unthinkable 6 months ago, let alone one with annual plans to show progress and commitment. It takes you back to Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it is done. And I think this is being done. It's reaffirmed Article 5, and it's got a strong and enduring commitment to Ukraine. And crucially, it didn't walk back from the language of Washington, which described an irreversible path to membership. For me, there are 4 key metrics that we need to judge this on. I mean, first of all, is the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, going to have the forces he needs to defend NATO and defer Russia by 2030? And will they be credible? That's lethal and sustainable. Secondly, will Ukraine have the support it needs to fight Russia to the negotiating table? Thirdly, is the industrial base of Europe, which now needs to take this huge amount of money, going to be freed from the shackles of regulation? And can we get over the 27 different national agendas so that we have a proper coherent defence industry? And finally, has NATO learned the incredible lessons that are coming out of Ukraine and now Israel about modern ways of fighting, and is it embedding that? So I think this is a net win for NATO, and you're going to tell me, Tom, why you think NATO is drowning.
I'm simply going to point out that you put 5 really, really good questions there to which there isn't an answer. And the one bit that you're stating as your evidence, which is, yes, we've all agreed these wonderful new targets, is just something on paper, which, by the way, if you're a lawyer, there's an opt-out for. So I think you are slightly guilty, dear General, here, of watching this summit from afar with rose-tinted spectacles on. I'm a bit more pessimistic, and I'll tell you why. There's a great irony of The Hague being location for this. And The Hague, if you think, it's Europol's headquarters is here. It's actually just around the corner from my slightly smelly car park of a press centre. The International Criminal Court is based here as well, where war criminals are taken for trial. So if you like, it's one of the epicenters of the old world order that used to preside over all those rules that the world was run by. It's straining at the bit of this summit to hold that disintegrating world together, I think. And my conclusion, it hasn't. It's tried, but I have to go more on the drowning side than the waving side if I was pushed, which you're doing, and really quite comfortably. I don't think we're there on the big step up on defence spending. I think there are too many caveats and opt-outs, and 2035 is certainly far, far too late, and you agree with me on that. What else is going to be voluntary as well, since that's been made voluntary for Spain? Will Article 5 one day be voluntary? I worry about that. I don't think we've agreed that Russia is an enemy. There's certainly quite a few countries won't say that. We just chatted that through. And here's my final point to you. The 32 different member state leaders cannot even sit down in a room together for a full day. It was 18 hours long. I have to tell you, it has the smell of a failing marriage about all this in its death throes, where a couple or 38 different couples can't even bear to be in the same room together. And I desperately hope I'm wrong, because NATO's been the most successful alliance in human history. But all the augurs are bad for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're flat wrong, Tom, but we can carry this on over the next few episodes. So I think that we've probably run out of time now. You certainly need to get away from the lingering smell that you described so colourfully earlier on. So thank you all for listening, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, and if you like what you've heard, do follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please email us as well with any questions or comments you have. We're really interested in them. The email address is generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. We read every one. So, Patrick, as I pack my bags in The Hague, from here, thank you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom.